Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah, wa la hawna wa la quwwata illa billah. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. I want to start off by apologizing that you have to deal with me this evening. Sheikh Yasir, he sends his dearest regards and his apologies for not being able to make it. As Yusuf already alluded to, he's not feeling too well. But alhamdulillah, he gave me the outline of sort of what he wanted to talk about, so I'm going to try to do it justice, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And as Yusuf mentioned, it's about the family of Ammar ibn Yasir. Now before we talk about the family of Ammar ibn Yasir, let's set this scene a little bit to how or what the situation was and how they were living in the time in Mecca. So when the Prophet ﷺ first received revelation, they were the minority, they were those people who were disenfranchised. The majority of people who first accepted Islam were people from a lower social class or a lower economic class. And because of that, in a very tribalistic environment, they didn't have family or monetary backing to strengthen them when they're being ridiculed by those people who had power. And the chieftains and the wealthy people of the society were doing everything in their ability to stop the spread of Islam. And this is for many, many different reasons. One reason is because the social and religious status quo was to worship many idols. You had an idol for this thing, an idol for that thing. But not only was this the social and religious status quo, this was also an economic status quo. Mecca, though the Kaaba was there were many different idols that surrounded around the Kaaba. And people would travel to make their form of a Hajj. And the people of Quraysh, or the people of Mecca at that time, they used this as a way to make money. They would charge for the clothes that you had to wear. They would charge room and board for staying in this area. So this is also a way for them to gain economic means. So by the Prophet ﷺ coming and teaching this new faith, Islam, challenging the faith of their forefathers, not only was it a social, it went against social norms, but it also hurt them economically. So this was a big problem. And they did everything in their means to stop that. They cursed the Prophet ﷺ and the companions. They make up lies about him, saying he was crazy, saying he was a magician. The people at that time were forced to wear a cloak of metal. I think I mentioned it, whether in the khutbah or the halaqah before. They were forced to wear cloaks, like armor of metal, and walk around Mecca in the heat while being chased by little kids, thrown with pebbles and rocks and cursed. It wasn't a nice situation. People were incarcerated, starved. There were many different things going on. It was so bad, the Prophet ﷺ, as you know, he sent a group of people to Al-Habasha, which is generally considered modern-day Ethiopia, which was much bigger at that time. He was sent to Al-Habasha to seek protection under a Christian rule. Side note, that was the first form of interfaith work during that time with a Christian leader, which Sheikh Mendez, who we all know he came to visit us before, he mentioned that last week when I was traveling. Al-Muhim, so speaking about this is how bad things were. It was so bad that people had to migrate. They had to leave their families, leave their homes. And it wasn't like today where you could travel, hop on a plane, you go somewhere else, and you're in this new place, you're at a hotel, it's all good. Think about where they're traveling on foot to go from Mecca to Jeddah or to wherever the water port was, to get on a boat, to go to a new land where they speak a different language and live amongst these people whose code of ethics and norms are completely different. It was very, very difficult. Leaving, the only thing that you could take with you were things on your back. So this is the framework of how things were, and this is how we have to understand things when we're thinking about the family of Ammar ibn Yasir. Now, so we can better understand his family itself. So this is the social setup. His family, the father Yasir, was a Yemeni man who migrated with his brothers to Mecca for business and trade. They all set up shop in Mecca, but most of them, all his other brothers went back to Yemen, leaving him alone in Mecca. So he's by himself, alone, not from this town. And he ended up taking almost like a code of honor or a treaty with a larger tribe there, just so he could have some social value in Mecca. And his mother, Ammar's mother, Sumayya, was a slave who was only freed when she was going to marry Yasir. So this is their family upbringing. Now their son Ammar was from the from the very first people to accept Islam. The son of an immigrant man and a freed slave was from the very first people to accept Islam. But not just that, he was from the first people and from the only people whose entire family accepted Islam while in Mecca. Some narrations say of the people whose families accepted Islam were only two, Ammar ibn Yasir and Abu Bakr. They were the only people whose families or parents accepted Islam with them prior to the hijrah, from the early muhajirin. So this is their family. And they were tormented because they were going against status quo. The politicians, the chieftains, the people who had money were doing everything they could to stop them. Ammar ibn Yasir was chained up and tormented so much so that he was unconscious. He couldn't remember, or he wasn't cognizant of what he was saying. And all of this was just so they would leave Islam. They would stop challenging the status quo. And his mother was murdered, and his father, both of them were murdered in front of him. His mother was stabbed by the spear of Abu Jahl in her chest, into her heart, until she died. Some narrations, I believe they said Ammar, his father, Yasir, was, tied his limbs, his different limbs tied to a horse, and they were commanded to run in different ways till he was decapitated. All of this happened right in front of him. And the Prophet ﷺ, he would come to console them. Sabran ya Ali Yasir. Be patient, O family of Yasir. فَإِنَّ مَوْعِدُكُمُ الْجَنَّةِ. For indeed, your abode, your final resting place, your destiny is Jannah. Trying to console them, teaching them to have patience, which the khutbah was about today. But they did everything they could to change their situation. But the one thing they wouldn't give up on was their faith. And they weren't the only ones. Bilal ibn Rabah, we know he was put in the middle of the desert, the hottest part of the desert, put a boulder on his chest just so he would change his statement from La ilaha illallah to other than that. And after Ammar ibn Yasir's parents were tormented and murdered in front of him, he never gave up his faith. Some narrations say other than that he said something alluding to other than that just so that he could be freed. But out of husn al-dhann for the companions, we're not even going to delve into that. We're going to say Ammar ibn Yasir, he never left his faith of the Prophet ﷺ. But because of what he went through, it fortified his faith for the rest of his life. When the Prophet ﷺ was asked about Ammar ibn Yasir, how was his faith? The Prophet ﷺ said that Iman filled his entire body from head to toe. When Ali ibn Abi Talib, the nephew of the Prophet ﷺ, the fourth Khalifa, was asked about Ammar ibn Yasir's faith, he said that he is a pure believer and that Iman has transcended to being the sight that he sees with and the hearing that he hears with. The punishment and the torment, the trials that he went through fortified his belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala so much so that this went on into the rest of his life. And this is from the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is how he lived on the rest of his life. Now, how can we benefit from that story in our lives? Because one thing to think about the companions, some people could say that was 1400 years ago, they had the Prophet around them, they were who they were, etc., etc. But as Imam Shafi'i says, which goes very hand in hand with what Sheikh Yasir was talking about, which is my favorite line of poetry, which I've probably said before because I only know about 2 different lines of poetry. He says, Sabran jamila ma aqrabul faraja. Be patient beautifully. What is closer to bliss? من راقب الله في الأمور النجاة. Whoever is cognizant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their affairs, then they will be successful. من صدق الله لم ينله الأذى. Whoever has trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they will never be harmed by anything. وَمِن رَجَاهُ يَكُونُ حِينَ رَجَى. And whoever has hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then this is when they truly have hope. So this is how we can summarize that whole story of Ammar ibn Yasir and how we should live our lives. And this is not to religiously bypass our natural emotions. This is not to say that because you may be scared or you may be fearful, you may be sad, you may be depressed, that you're just supposed to have faith and you're going to be okay. Unfortunately, there's no magic cloak as we see some people in flicks where I just swing it at you and then you fall back and you believe, alhamdulillah, you're cured. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. We all have emotions, we all have feelings. And I mention this because it's something that people of faith, religious people, quote unquote, because our true level of iman and faith is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we don't know. But people who are spiritual people, they always just say, brother, have faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sister, believe in Allah. It's going to be okay. You don't believe? And while we might do that because our faith, we're able to do that ourselves, you may only spiral someone into a worse situation, making them doubt the faith that they already have and making them go further into despair. So this is not to religiously bypass saying that we have to have faith and we don't feel. We all have fears. Sheikh Yasir, he mentioned to us in one of the halaqas that there are different types of fear. There is an absolute fear, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala controls everything. Nothing happens except that He knows how it was going to be, how it is, how it will be, and if it wasn't going to be, how it could have been. Allah knows everything. And nothing happens except that He is in control of that and preordained it before mankind was created. We understand that. But there's also a natural fear. There's a natural fear of something that's very real. I am scared to spill this tea right here because I'm going to mess with the microphone and Yusuf is going to make me pay for it. That's a natural fear. I'm worried that my kids will grow up to be righteous people. I'm worried that, etc., etc., etc. These are natural fears that we all have. And we cannot bypass how we feel. But taking into consideration the times that we're in, both socially, both and politically, what are some things that we can take away from and we can strengthen our faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and have patience in what we're going through? And these are not from me, these are from the advice of Sheikh Yasir and what I've read from other scholars who have only mentioned it. The first and foremost thing, we got to double down on Allah. Like you get a double shot of espresso to get you the extra boost, we need to double down. We need an extra shot of Allah in our lives. We have to be Allah-centric, focus on Allah in everything that we do. If we're just reading, our obligatory prayers, we got to try now to do a little bit extra. If you're reading one line of Quran a day, we need 2 lines now. Because the more we're in connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more we're in focus, the more we're in thought of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the meaning of taqwa, then this is how Allah will truly permeate everything that we do, and we will truly be able to have patience. And the first thing we can do if we're going to double down on Allah, if we're going to take things into second gear to strengthen ourselves in a time when things look meek, is focus on the big things before the small things. If we're not getting up for Fajr, let's get up for Fajr. If we're having a hard time praying Isha before we go to sleep, we're waking up right after Fajr comes in, we got to pray Isha on time. The obligatory things come first and foremost. If we're binging on Netflix and we forgot to pray Dhuhr and Asr because set a reminder on your phone, make sure we're praying Dhuhr and Asr on time. When the Super Bowl is on, you don't want to push pause because the fourth quarter is going to be amazing. We have to remember to pray. So focus on the obligatory things, those things that we know that we're not supposed to be slipping on. We have to focus on those things first before we start worrying about, are we praying all of our sunnahs, witr, are we doing our juz of Quran every day, etc. After that, after doubling down on Allah, this is trademarked, I made this up, so no one else say that. After that, we have to figure out what's in our capacity. Figure out what is in our capacity to do, and then do it. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Al-mu'min al-qawi khayrun wa ahabbu ila Allah min al-mu'min al-da'if wa fi kullin khayr." The strong believer is better and more beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the weak believer, but in each one there is goodness. And this you could give entire lectures and probably write books on it itself. But that's not the shahid, that's not the point I want to mention. The point that I want to mention, it was the Prophet ﷺ, he says, "Ihris ala ma yanfa'ak." Be diligent in those things that will benefit you. "Wasta'in billah." Seek aid in Allah. "Wala ta'jaz." And do not tire. Do not let go. Figure out what we can do, those things that are strengthen us, whether it be getting involved civically, whether it's, becoming more active in the community, whether it's educating ourselves on policies, whatever it may be. Figuring out what's in our capacity and focusing on that and that alone. And the last thing that I'll mention, which is stolen from our Christian brothers and sisters, we just have to let go and let God. Realize at the end of the day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control of all things. So after we have taken all the asbab, we've taken all the means, we have tried to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have been focusing on those obligatory things, those things that are going to get us closer to Him that we know we're not supposed to be missing anyways. We're trying to do some extra things. We have figured out what is in our capacity to change. What lies outside of that, we have to leave up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Know that whether we can see the wisdom, whether we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, Allah has a wisdom in everything that He puts us in. وَلَا يُكَلِّفُ اللَّهُ نَفْسًا إِلَّا وُسْعَهَا. Allah will not burden us with anything more than what we can control. And after we have taken all the asbab, after we have exhausted all the means, knowing that there is an almighty, all supreme, all knowing, all aware God who controls everything, should bring us at least a little bit of solace. That is what we should let go and let God. Just realize that this is from a wisdom that I don't have the ability to see. And know that He will not do something without wisdom. He doesn't do anything haphazardly. So even trials and challenges and tests that we go through, whether they be we see the benefit in them in this life or we see the ajr for them in the next life, there's a reason that we're going through them. So, yes, there was one last point that I wanted to mention. After we let go and let God, and we realize our limitations, that doesn't mean we don't prepare, which also falls into the previous point. We still have to prepare. I was listening to a podcast earlier today, which was talking about financial wealth and how financial wealth is different based upon how people are raised and their racial and economic background. And it was saying how wealthy families, their children and grandchildren generally are better off because they have not just are able to do in their better situations, they have ladders, they have ways to help them get better. Their families generally leave them things which enable to put them in better situations. And it got into policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have to prepare the same way for our children. We have to do that much more so that maybe we're not going to get to the dream that we want to get to, but that we perhaps put ladders that help our children and grandchildren see a better situation that we're in. So we have to prepare. And as I'll conclude with what Sheikh Yasir concluded his khutbah with, Surah Al-Asr. Because everything I said, you might forget as soon as you leave the masjid, but we all recite probably Surah Al-Asr every single day in our prayers. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, Wal Asr. He swears by time. And this in of itself is showing not only how magnificent time is and how extreme of a thing it is, but also how something we tended to take for granted. He says, Wal Asr innal insana lafi khusr. Indeed, insan, people, insan of itself could be a person, as some of the Arab grammarians say, is a person who's often forgetting. Lafi khusr. they're at loss. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ, except, so Allah swore by time. He said mankind is doomed, for lack of better words. This is my translation. Mankind is doomed except for people, إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, except for the people who believe and do good deeds. وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ, and they encourage, or as Shaykh Yasir mentioned earlier, they extol with sabr, بالحق, with the truth. They encourage people to do what is right, and they encourage each other to have patience. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us patience and strength and forbearance in the up and coming days and for the rest of our lives. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to not only give us strength, but to give us power to excel and make us stronger and to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to, after going through hardships and difficulties, to learn from them and become stronger. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us a stronger community, because we truly need unity and togetherness in all times, but specifically in times of hardship. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable us to bear any trials and torment that may come our way. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the patience that the family of Yasir went through. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to not only allow us to be patient, but to be patient beautifully. وأقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين واستغفروه وأتوب إليه.